Mr. Michael Dickinson. We are, of course, the DFS Army Fantasy Football Show. I'm your host, Flex Shane. Mike, it has been a long and tumultuous road to the fantasy football playoffs, but we are entering week 15. How many leagues are you in your playoffs in? Like, how many playoffs are you playing here?
I made playoffs in about a third of my leagues, which
That's
is
pretty good.
which is far below what I usually hit. Usually I'm about half to 2/3. I'm not Seslowski level, but I think
Yeah.
between dynasty and redraft, I'm in about 21 leagues. So with the number of leagues like that and the way that I like to play, I like to spread out my exposure. So
Mm.
because I have pieces of almost every single guy, it's tough to have spots where it's tough to make the playoffs in every single spot. But I had an atypically poor year in redraft this year. If we're being candid right out of the
Yeah,
gate.
no, it's okay. Obviously, you weren't using the DFS Army draft tools, because if you were using those tools, then you would have been doing pretty well. I missed the playoffs in two of my leagues. One of my dynasty leagues I missed, where I was, oh no, Jen, you're out everywhere. That's not good. It's because you let Flex Matt help you draft your redraft leagues. That's
Yeah.
the problem right there. No, I missed my playoffs in two leagues. Honestly, one of the more devastating ones was, so it's my home league. It's a 10-person league. And I was in the hunt, like in the lead most of the season, and then literally the last week of the season, I got knocked out. Raheem Mostert was like, whatever, 5 minutes of glory, basically kicked my ass out. So nobody cares about our fantasy teams, though, Mike. But listen, we're here today to reflect on the path to the 2023 playoffs. Everything that we do it comes down to decisions, from our drafts to our waiver acquisitions to our start sit decisions. It's all about our weekly decisions and a bunch of micro decisions leading up to here. So overall, there's definitely trends. There's definitely overarching strategies that we'll kind of discuss on the show today, such as zero QB. We're going to talk about some of the different systems, but we basically broke it down into 10 things that you and I wanted to reflect on. And Mike, since you're late to the program here, why don't you give me your first item that you wanted to reflect on?
My first item to reflect on was the fact that the first round this year was an absolute freaking landmine.
Totally.
But what I'll say to that, though, is that every single team had a first round draft pick, and in most of your leagues, half your teams are going to the playoffs. So it's possible to overcome your first round landmine. But when you look at the top 12, as everything settled in, you look at the top 12 players by ADP. Was Jefferson, McCaffrey, Jamar Chase, Eckler, Kelsey at 5, Tyreek, Saquon, Bijan, Steph Diggs, Chubb, Devontae Adams, CeeDee Lamb. That rounded out the first round. As we sit here, week 15, the top 12 fantasy players, this is just flex rankings. This is non-QB. Tyreek Hill, McCaffrey, Lamb, Keenan Allen, A.J. Brown, Jamar Chase, Raheem Mostert, Steph Diggs, DJ Moore, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Travis Etienne, and Mike Evans. And honorable mention in ADP is obviously the Rams wide receiver 1, Cooper Kupp. Honorable mention in fantasy performance is obviously the Rams wide receiver 1, Puka Nacua. So what it goes to show is that you're probably, the way that it sits now, you're probably not going to win your draft. You're probably not going to win your league in the first round. You can mess it up easily by, probably not by your own fault, by drafting a player that gets injured, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But just because the first round is an absolute landmine doesn't mean that you're not gonna push forward and you're not gonna win your leagues.
Yeah, and I think what's kind of an interesting take out of that, and you brought it up, is like, as much as we can look back at the round one picks, typically people are going to follow ADP, right? Because there is something to be said about consensus, right? There's a lot of different minds out there that drive these ADPs, and there's definitely consensus out there. But you look at some of these guys. Now, I looked at it from, like, not overall fantasy points, but just overall fantasy points per game. And some of the players that definitely stand out, like Keenan Allen, I think we knew that he was going to have a good season, but again, he had just another electric season, and at his age, like, it continues to just be so impressive what Keenan Allen is achieving. I wouldn't say Cam Akers was highly drafted, but he was drafted to the point where the expectation was he was going to be RB1 in LA, because we know that in a perfect system, Sean McVay loves to just use those freaking running backs. And guess what? Kyron Williams, drafted at 187 overall, average ADP, is sitting at 5th overall in terms of fantasy points per game. So that's pretty impressive. Alvin Kamara, I mean, obviously you got a discount on him because of the early season suspension, but he hasn't missed a beat, and that's pretty impressive. And then last player here is Devon Achane, which, I mean, what can you say about him, right? I mean, you look at him, you look at Mostert, and just overall production of that Miami Dolphins team. It's hard to say, okay, we whiffed on those players, right? So it's certainly something that we need to reflect on going into next year. And that kind of leads into my first point here, Mike, and that is basically, did the zero RB strategy play out, right? There was lots of people out there who were advocating a zero RB mindset, draft wide receiver early. And listen, if you just drafted Justin Jefferson at the 101, listen, when he was on, he produced. The problem is he didn't play a lot of games. Jamar Chase, he had some injuries, and obviously Joe Burrow leaving is a huge hit for him. It makes you think, though, Mike, do you remember at the start of the season where Jamar, remember Burrow was dealing with the ankle injury, and then Jamar said, listen, it would be better for this guy to settle for the first month. In hindsight, it probably was. Oh, God. And then to Jen's point, Higgins was the worst drop pick. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because Burrow just wasn't, for one, he was crap the first month of the season, and then he got hurt. So
Yeah, I think with the Chase thing, I think that, and we'll talk about injuries a little bit later, but I think that was one of those things where you're looking at, you're looking at the supporting pieces that need to go and that need to be in place for that player to thrive. So you have a quarterback that missed the entirety of camp. He was questionable to start the season. He was questionable
yeah.
whether or not he was going to even suit up week one. Like, he was questionable going all the way into the run up. Like, we were waiting with our fingers crossed, bated breath, to see if he was going to be active. So I think that, if you were drafting in early July, Chase was obvious. But as you got closer to the season, and there was all that stuff coming out of camp, like, you were a little nervous about Chase. And if you took him in the first round there, you kind of had to build around him and temper your expectations a little bit. But I think that's another thing where hindsight's 2020. Like, yeah, looking back on it, we wanted it to be that if Joe Burrow was going to play, he was going to be 100%, and he was just going to feed Chase, and it wasn't true.
Yeah, and I think too, like, the other thing with that is that, you got a point, so I don't want to steal your thunder a little bit later, but like the idea of being injury agnostic as you enter the season, like if a player is injured, there's risk that gets associated with that, right? Sometimes you can overcome that risk. Other times you get absolutely burned by it. One of the things that was kind of interesting, though, like in terms of risk and where we were drafting Christian McCaffrey. So CMC went 3 overall with Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase generally going before him. And obviously you could argue the case that CMC should have been the 101, even without hindsight bias, right? Because of the production, because of the workload that we know he's going to be getting. But then it's a matter of, well, he's been injured before multiple times, major injuries. He's getting older. So there's that injury risk, but he's stayed healthy. So how do you reconcile that?
I think in hindsight, you reconcile it by saying the injury actually was baked in. His injury history was baked into him at 103.
True. Yeah.
If without, but again, it's hindsight's 2020. So if you knew CMC was going to play 17 games and was going to get his workload 17 games in that offense with Brock Purdy, with all those pieces, with Ayuk, with Debo, with that offensive line, with that defense, with George Kittle, if you knew he was going to be there for 17 games, I don't think it's even close, because you look at the advantage that he gives you over every other single running back. It's not even like, I take that 100 times out of 100. So I think that injury was baked in by him dropping all the way down to the 3rd overall pick.
So put your crystal ball, or look into your crystal ball, Mike. We're in February, March. We're starting our early best balls for next year. Is CMC going to be the 101, or are people going to go right back to Justin Jefferson?
I think that the short-term memory and the PTSD is real. So I think that, the players that got burned by Jefferson are not going to go back to him. I think CMC is going to be the 101 consensus.
Let me ask you
And
this:
we could see that ride all the way until beginning of middle of August. Obviously, we get into camps, there's injury, there's all this sorts of stuff, but like, I don't see any reason why we're going to waver off that.
Well, I mean, the only argument would be well, we don't know what's going to happen with Kirk Cousins. He's a free agent after this year. He cannot be franchise tagged again. So if Minnesota wants to retain him, they're going to have to pay him, right? That's just a fact.
Yep.
Minnesota, I think would be a very interesting candidate if the Bears decide to move on from Justin Fields. I think Minnesota would be a very interesting candidate for that type of offense. We've shown that he can keep the top wide receiver productive. So there's certain situations as we get closer to draft where I could see considering Justin Jefferson at the 101 again. I think we both expect T. Higgins to be gone and out of Cincinnati. So Jamar Chase again, consolidated target share, assuming Burrow's healthy. That's certainly a case. But Christian McCaffrey, man. So currently CMC is, and now I probably should have prepared this, but how old is CMC right now? He's 27, 28.
27, 28, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, that in itself creates a question mark in terms of let's see here. I ran it this morning, so you think I could find it, but I got a filter on. This is great radio, Mike. Yeah, he's 27.5. Okay, which means next summer is when he's going to be turning 28.
Yeah, and here's the other thing too is we completely forgot about Tyreek Hill. We haven't mentioned Tyreek Hill.
I mean, that's the win. That was the nuts, right? If you went Tyreek Hill, to me, that's the nuts. Because if you went Tyreek Hill early, and just look, just do a quick scan in your leagues, people who are listening or watching the show. Bali, see you in the chat. Appreciate you, brother. Have a look at your leagues, Bali. How many of the teams in your leagues that had Tyreek Hill on their team are currently just chilling this week because they got a bye week? A lot of teams in my leagues, Tyreek Hill was one of the reasons for that. Is Tyreek Hill? Let's say, okay, he's questionable with the ankle right now. Let's say he's healthy, or let's say he plays and he's productive. Is he the MVP? If Miami
100%.
goes, yeah,
100% he's the MVP. 100% he's the MVP. I mean, he's gonna put up almost 2,000 yards this year. Like, and that's with Tua's been up and Tua's been down, but I mean, he's gonna put up almost 2,000 yards this year. He's on pace to have the best season a wide receiver has ever had in the history of the NFL. And I know you can make the case for Dak, but Dak has played poor in spurts. Tyreek has produced every single freaking week.
Yeah.
And so back to what we were talking about before. When you look at the difference between, you can make the argument for Tyreek or Christian McCaffrey at the 101. Mm-hmm. Tyreek is the current wide receiver 1 at 322 in a PPR, 323 points. CeeDee Lamb is wide receiver 2 with 284 points. Christian McCaffrey is RB1 at 311 points. Raheem Mostert is the RB2 at 237 points. So McCaffrey's 84 points ahead of the next closest guy. ETN is behind him at 227. And then you drop all the way down to Rachaad White at 204. So you're looking, the difference between RB1 and RB4 is 107 points. You look at the difference between wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 4 is 70 points. Like, that's a big spread, but the hammer that CMC gives you over every single other running back, I think is too much to overcome as long as he's going to be healthy. So I think that really makes the case for him to be the 101 next year.
So I'm trying to remember what show I was listening to. I think it might have actually been a RotoWire show. And on that show, they were just talking about how in other fantasy sports, now I don't play any other fantasy sports, but like, for example, fantasy baseball or even fantasy hockey, right? There's typically, it's going to be the strength of your team that's going to lead you overall into the playoffs. Whereas in fantasy football, more than any of these other fantasy sports, it's the strength of one or two high impactful players on your team that are going to get you into the playoffs. And that's because once you start getting to that wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 range, there's not a lot of points on a given week that are going to really differentiate these positions, which, Mike, that was one of the reasons why forever people were taking running backs early in their drafts, right? Because the impact typically of those high-end running backs, those bell cow running backs, were so impactful to help you get to the playoffs. The way that the NFL is starting to shift, there's now all of these shared backfields. There isn't that de facto workhorse running back anymore. And so that kind of leads on to my next question, which I'm going to go into mine just because I think it's relative to our conversation here. And that's the idea, like, so the zero RB zealots out there, like that trend is going to continue, right? Especially going into next year, because people saw how late you could get running backs. But The thing is, though, is that are these running backs going to continue to be a discount, Mike, if everybody's fading them until, say, round 3 or 4, right? Like, it's all relative to the market.
Yeah. See, I think what's going to happen is you're going to see people start to jump ADP by a quarter round. Then they'll jump ADP by a half round. Then they'll jump ADP by a round because they're
Mm,
trying to one up their league mates on this zero RB strategy. And I think that, and we talked about this a lot in our group chat. Like for me, I went out and tried to deploy either zero RB or hero RB in every single
yep.
one of my leagues this year, and I don't think it's any coincidence that I ended up not making the playoffs in any of my redraft leagues. Like it for players as well, like you need to marry up what your in-season strategy is and what kind of in-season play you are versus your draft strategy. So like somebody like Matt Beck, who's on with us, another member of the DFS Army,
Mhm.
he's the perfect zero RB guy because he's super aggressive out on the waiver wire. He blew 85% of his fab on Kyron Williams week 1, and it was the right decision. Even though Williams
Yeah.
went down, it was the right decision because if you waited until round 7 to draft your first running back and you ended up with freaking Khalil Herbert and Rashad White. Yeah, you rode Rashad White the first week. Khalil Herbert did okay for you, but then you blow 85% of your fab on Kyron Williams and you're rolling Kyron Williams and Rashad White, you're in great shape. But if you're not willing to be that aggressive, I myself tend to be slightly more conservative. Let me wait a week and see if what I'm seeing is what I'm actually seeing. If you wait a week, you're usually too late. So I think I'm gonna probably pivot back a little bit more to the best player available and then
Mhm.
take these draft values as they come out. It's more of a value-based drafting, and I think that that's really where if you try and marry too hard into a strategy going into your draft, you end up falling into pits and traps and you end up with a roster that you really don't like. And that's kind of where I sat at the end of a lot of my drafts. I'm like, I tried to stay hard on this strategy and I don't like this freaking roster. And then, you're constantly trying to play catch up the rest of the season. And I think that's where a lot of people are going to end up if you try and stay married to one philosophy.
I think you brought up a really good point because I mean, like, I feel like you could have an entire show just on waiver wire strategy. Period. Right? I know it's a conversation that Alan Seslowski and I have had. We've all had with him for a long time now, and that is when and how do you spend your fab, right? Because ultimately, we spend months and months and months building our draft strategy, understanding player takes, having convictions on players, right? So you go and you draft your team, and typically, the back end of your bench are your high upside players you think are going to pop, right? Which usually it's guys you don't expect to pop in week 1 or 2. So then week 1 happens, and there are crazy outcomes that we don't expect, like Kyron Williams, like you mentioned. And then the question is, okay, as a player evaluation, I didn't like Kyron Williams. There was based on a lot of his metrics, based on a lot of his athleticism scores, he didn't pop in my mind, right? And then when you went to the actual pre-draft process, he frankly disappointed, right? And then he didn't do much because, well, he was kind of a slug before. This year comes out, he's given the opportunity. He had multiple games where he had 100% opportunity share in the running back position, which is unheard of in 2023. And so, how do you marry that and say, you pull a map? I mean, Matt spent 85% of his fab because he was a huge Kyron Williams guy. That was one of his players, right? So he's like, okay, I like this player. He popped. He's got the opportunity. Boom, I'm going to go spend my fab because, as Alan Seslowski says, the value that you're spending earlier on in the season, you're going to get that value more if you have that player on your team longer, right? If you save 85% of your fab budget until the last week of the season, well, the amount of fantasy points per fab is much lower versus if you spend it early on in the season, right? So that's just something too you have to understand, and that's why, Mike, we spend so much time in the rookie draft process, so that when one of these guys do pop, we have a better understanding and a better feel of, okay, do we think this is sustainable, or is this just a flash in the pan? And I think that's really
Yeah.
interesting.
And that's how we got on guys like Pacheco and Rashad White.
Yes.
We were probably a year early on Rashad White last year because Fournette was still there. But like, that's how we got onto guys like that. And it's all a question of your process, knowing how you like to play, how you like to build your rosters, and how you like to evaluate your guys. But when you land on your guys, I think you gotta build out your preseason process and your rookie evaluation process so that when this stuff pops up, you can make a judgment. You can make a judgment call. You can say, okay, this is week one, Kyron Williams goes off. He
Mhm.
usurps Cam Akers. He makes Cam Akers a complete non-factor. He I think he was the RB1 overall week one. Am I going to blow my money on him? And like I look at it, and I'm like, I didn't really like him week one. I think that was a flash in the pan. That was a function of no
Yeah.
Cooper Cup. Somebody getting reacquainted with the new offense. I'm gonna wait. And everybody else picked him up, and I was a week too late. So it kind of is what it is. You lick your wounds and move on, and you gotta adjust your process. But I think that ultimately you adjust your process as you want to, and you stick with your process as you need to.
The other thing too is that I've had success in previous seasons where come week 13, 14 leading up to the playoffs, or 12, 13 in previous years, um, I typically had a fair amount of fab left, to the point where as major injuries happen, as things change, you are in a good position to go out and win that player on fab. So there's definitely something to having a little bit of cash left in that bank. So then as we're getting closer to the playoffs and all the other teams have blown their fab budget, you're still going to be the one that can go out there and secure that high player. For example, in Urban Dynamics Boys League, I had the highest fab and I was able to go out and get Zamir White because I had Josh Jacobs. I liked Zamir White's prospect. Now, people who might forget, it was Zamir White, it was James Cook, it was a Thunder Lightning offense when they came into the league.
Oh,
And
yeah.
James
Yep.
Cook, I think, has had a pretty decent year. Year one last year, the rookie year, not good. But this year, James Cook has had a bigger role, has done well. Zamir White, stuck behind Josh Jacobs, hasn't done squat. But you see, given an opportunity, and listen, that Thursday night game was an abomination, and you can't really ever bank on that. But he put up over 17 points in a PPR, and that saved my bacon because I had the fab available to go and make that acquisition. So there's definitely strategies both ways, but it's what is your propensity for risk, and that's what it comes down to. You and I think are a little bit more conservative. Our other two show hosts, Flex Matt and Brandon, they're YOLO baby. They don't give a shit. They'll go for it. They'll go all in. So it's all about your approach. Mike,
Yep.
give me your other another takeaway for the 2023
So I
season.
have I have two that kind of go hand in hand. The my number two is to trust good coaching systems and good offenses,
Yep.
and my number three is to ignore or appropriately scale down bad coaching systems. So
Yep.
you look at when you look at the top of the fantasy points chart, you got Tyreek Hill up there, you got Raheem Mostert up there, Waddle's not too far down, and then you see A Chain on a per game basis is up there as well. That's straight up a function of their system. You look at the five players you can start every single week in San Francisco. You can start Purdy, Ayuk, McCaffrey, Debo when he's healthy, and Kittle. And
Mhm.
obviously you need to understand what the range of outcomes is, but like those are guys that if you have them, you can plug them into your system every single week. You can plug them into your lineup every single week, and you can know about what you're going to get. Like you're not worried if they're going to go for 6 points or if they're going to go for 35 points. They're probably going to go, they're going to go between 15 and 18 points, and they might have a blow up week, and you're going to be in good shape. Then on the flip side of that coin, you look at other systems. You look at like New England and what we're dealing with
Mm.
with the New England running backs and the New England wide receivers. Like on our bold calls show, I, much to the chagrin of Brandon, said that I thought that Stevenson and Ezekiel Elliott were both going to be running back twos just because of everything that had gone on there. Belichick has never had a back-to-back 1,000-yard rusher. They spent a lot of time dragging RB2s through there in the offseason. They said they wanted to depress Stevenson's workload. Stevenson's ADP still finished up pretty high. When you're looking at it at the end of it, Stevenson ended up as an RB11. He's currently sitting as the RB25. Part of that's due to injury. Part of it
Mhm.
is due to depressed workload, and part of it is due to, quite frankly, systematic dysfunction. Um, and then you look at what our expectations were for the offense in Atlanta. I was super high on Bijan Robinson, and I
Mhm.
think that was the correct process. He was not going to. He shouldn't have shared. He was a high value real draft pick. He was drafted at eighth overall on a rookie deal with no mileage on him in the NFL, with a poor performing quarterback who in a low passing volume offense, everything led you to believe that he was going to be the bell cow, do exactly what Barkley and Zeke Elliott did in their first years. And I think at worst, I was expecting him to be RB4. And then you get Arthur freaking Smith, who has to trot Tyler Algier out there and vulture 2 touchdowns in the first week. And it just went all over the board from there. So I think that when you look at it, trust and invest in good offenses and then adjust appropriately for poor offenses and poor offensive systems. And I'm not saying poor from an NFL standpoint. I'm saying poor from a fantasy performance standpoint. In the rare opportunity we've been able to trust Bill Belichick running backs, so now to all of a sudden think that we're going to be able to trust Stevenson as a week in and week out RB1 was in hindsight probably a fool's errand. You know, I think that we were hoping that we were going to see the Tennessee Arthur Smith and what he was able to do with Derrick Henry rather than the Atlanta Arthur Smith and the fuckery that he deployed with Cordero Patterson and Tyler Algier in the 2022 season. We were hoping that was all going to go away and he was just going to let Bijan be Bijan. So trust historical data and trust coaching systems both on the positive side and on the negative side.
Yeah, I mean, Bijan Robinson, as we've completed now 14 weeks, he's played 13
weeks.
games, and he is at 15 points per game, right? So he's still been pretty productive when you look at just overall productivity relative to the position class, but he's still a disappointment for the round 1 draft selection. I think that's certain. And then what this actually kind of drives into my next topic here is you talk about systems. Well, the system, I think, is a massive contributing factor to the success overall of the quarterback, right? I mean, you look no further than Brock Purdy, who in a lot of statistics that matter, touchdowns, passing yards, wins, Brock Purdy is definitely up there, right? I mean, I don't know the exact stat, but I think it's now essentially when Brock Purdy's been healthy, they've got their core group of like Deebo Samuel and Bosa and CMC. When they're all healthy, San Francisco doesn't lose games. And what's kind of interesting, so I was looking here at like the quarterback position overall, right? And so the question I have is like, is it worth going and drafting quarterback early when you see guys who have frankly been disappointing? Like, yes, Kate, from a fantasy points per game perspective here, okay? So your top 3 are Josh Allen, okay, he was overall ADP of 24. Jalen Hurts, overall ADP of 23. Dak Prescott, not ADP, 29, Josh Allen, 25, Jalen Hurts. Dak Prescott, he was at 121 overall. So obviously that is a system-driven thing. Like, I think people need to give credit what credit's due with Dak Prescott, but he's a system-driven thing. Lamar Jackson, he does it on his own. But then when you look at the next players on the list here, you got Brock Purdy, system. Kirk Cousins, I would argue, system. Sam Howell, I would argue, system. CJ Stroud, he's just a stud, baby. I just love CJ Stroud. Patrick Mahomes, he's had a disappointing season, but that's also driven by, I think, the system, right? They haven't gone. And they said they did so well last year. They said, well, we don't need to surround Patrick Mahomes with wide receivers. Mahomes will figure it out. It hasn't worked, so that's been a bad system. Justin Fields is running quarterback, and then Jordan Love, I think, again, a pretty good system. So when we're looking next year, I mean, I still think that there's value in drafting quarterbacks early, but do you think this year, the thirst for quarterbacks was like none other? They were going so early, and I feel like after this year, again, only one season, it's still only 14 games, people, it's still considered a small sample size, but are people going to be a little bit more reluctant to draft quarterback early, or do you think that they're still going to go and take swings on Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes in early round 3, late round 2?
I don't know. I don't think that you're going to need to, and I think that I think that the players that dip their toe into it this year are probably going to wade back and are going to pull back. The players that have always been, give me a stud quarterback early are going to stay there. So I think you'll see it back off a little bit. Just looking at overall ADP, there were 7 quarterbacks taken in the first 4 rounds. I don't think that we'll see that again next year because I don't think that there's the necessity for that. I think the other thing we're going to see too is that I think you're going to see I think we could see as many as 7 quarterbacks taken in the first 2 rounds of the actual NFL draft next year, and there could be
Yep.
a lot of new guys starting on new teams next year. So, you look at where let me pull this up real quick. You look at where CJ Stroud was drafted in the beginning of the season, and CJ Stroud, who's currently sitting at QB6, was taken way, 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 way down. He was
Yeah.
QB 24 at 193 overall. He was basically freeing your draft. So I think people are going to look at that. They're going to try and project out who's going to be the next Stroud. You look at where Sam Howell went. I got Sam Howell in like the 14th, 15th round as a backup, as a secondary QB option. So, I think that those of us that dipped our toe in, say, oh, I'm gonna mess around with early QB. I'm gonna get an Allen or a Herbert or a Hurts, and at the behest of a stud positional player. I think that those of us that did that are gonna go back the other way and go late QB and stream QB and tight end like we always do. Those of us that have always done early QB are going to continue to do early QB. So I think we'll probably see 4
Yeah.
QBs go in the first 4 rounds next year.
I was pretty aggressive on drafting Jalen Hurts. If you fell to me in the early 3rd round, I was pretty aggressive getting Jalen Hurts. And I'm still pretty happy that I went with Jalen Hurts. I mean, unfortunately, last week was the worst week of the season. It was, again, just a debacle. But I still believe there's some value. But round 1 and round 2, to me, is probably going to be hands off, unless it's, you throw in a dart in a few of these best ball leagues, but the value just isn't there relative to the skill position players you can get. And I mean, you can still wait on these quarterbacks as long as you can identify these successful systems. And that's half the battle, Mike, right? Like, we try to evaluate what we believe is going to, like, we thought that the Chargers were going to be a good system. It just wasn't. It didn't work. The Kellen Moore experiment did not work. But I think we were all excited when Kellen Moore went over to the Chargers, right?
Oh my God, we were so excited because we saw
Yeah.
glimpses of what we thought Dak could be, but we thought that McCarthy was the one who was holding Kellen Moore back. In reality, it looks like Kellen Moore was the one holding Mike McCarthy back, which who would have
Yeah.
thunk it? I would have thought he was a caveman. I would have thought they were going to run the ball 400 times a game, and Dak would have thrown it 7.
It's so
Live
crazy.
and learn.
It's so crazy, man. It's so crazy. Okay, give me another takeaway that you had for this season, Mike.
All right, another takeaway from this season is the fact that we need to temper our expectations on a lot of these quote unquote breakout candidates.
Yeah.
So we look at, and this this show included, we were Brandon, and justifiably so. Brandon was super high on Trevor Lawrence and Calvin Ridley. The drumbeat coming out of camp was great. It was a consistent drumbeat. It was Ridley looks great. Ridley looks amazing. Ridley looks amazing. Trevor Lawrence has taken that step forward. We saw what, Doug Peterson did with the likes of Carson Wentz and how he progressed him all the way through. Press Taylor there. The same thing had lined up for the Jaguars as it did for those 2017 Philadelphia Eagles. And the whole thing just kind of fell apart. You look at, so I think that expecting a player to go from, being a career wide receiver, low end wide receiver to mid tier 2 to being an alpha and being a high end 1 is, while it's super exciting, it's kind of one of those things where you got to temper your expectations a little bit. Is a player who's only had one wide receiver 1 year all of a sudden now going to be a wide receiver 1 consistently? Probably not. Is this guy who's struggled a little bit in the NFL and who's looked like the game is bigger than him a little bit, but has been super solid and super consistent, is he ready to take this leap all the way forward? Probably not. The Justin Herberts, the Trevor Lawrences of the world are more typical than the Brock Purdy's of the world. Players typically are what they are, and they grow progressively over time, rather than Mr. Irrelevant, who was undrafted last year, was drafted at the tail end of drafts this year, and is now QB6. Those cases are much less prevalent than the cases of, players moving within a range of outcomes. I got caught with Daniel Jones, thinking that Daniel Jones would take another leap forward in Brian Daboll's offense and would be a mid-tier QB1. Before he got hurt, he was absolute garbage. He was like a back-end QB2. So, historically, players are who they are, and they're not gonna alter much within that range.
That's a really good take. And I think what kind of fooled us about Daniel Jones was, one, in general, like the Brian Daboll offense last year looked amazing. He won Coach of the Year last year. Daniel Jones looked like he was who we thought he could be with that rushing upside, right? He looked good, and then he turned back into a pumpkin, which is pretty
He
disappointing. But
just looked
listen,
lost.
listen, I I admit this is probably 100% my bias because I was so high in Trey Lance, but you got to give credit where credit's due. Like Mr. Irrelevant Brock Purdy, some of the stats that he's been successful in, total QBR, he's at 77 overall instead of 100. That leads all these top players. It leads Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Dak Prescott, Lamar Jackson. In terms of air yards per attempt, so that's because everybody says, well, it's these yards after the catch receivers that are making him successful. Well, his air yards per attempt is 8.07. You compare that to Dak Prescott. Dak Prescott, 7.92. It's a little bit lower than Josh Allen, 8.25, Jalen Hurts, 8.61, but it's still higher than Kirk Cousins with 7.11, Sam Howell, 7.6. CJ Stroud was 9.23, which is pretty impressive. But basically, like he was an above average yards per or air yards per attempt. And that in itself is definitely value over just saying he's a totally, well, I'd say he's a system quarterback. I wouldn't call him a game manager, right? Because like again, that is pejorative in the
No,
words
not at all.
of the masses. But okay, so another thing too that kind of I'm trying to reflect on is Mike, you and I are historically sizeists. Well, you more so than me, right? We're sizeists in
Much
terms
more
of
so.
how we draft our players, but a lot of these smaller players have been successful. So when I look at the wide receiver position, right, typically when I say a small wide receiver, it's under 180 pounds. But you look at these players this year, for example. So this is just ranked in terms of fantasy points per game. So Tank Dell, he's 165 pounds, 15 fantasy points per game. Devonta Smith, stud, 170 pounds, 14.9. Jordan Addison, 173 pounds, 13.04. And then you got Marquise Brown, he's 166 at 10.3. Then now the rest of these guys were not as productive. Josh Downs, Tutu Atwell, Elijah Moore, Wan'Dale Robinson, Demario Douglas, all of these guys in that range, they scored between, call it right around 8 to 8.5 points per game. So on the wide receiver side of things, I'd say that our priors, yes, we had some hits, but probably as long as like if these guys are elite wide receiver prospects like a Devonta Smith, like a Jordan Addison, I still think it's safe to fade the small wide receiver. Like you're gonna hit more often than you miss. So I think check to Mike and Shane for being sizes there. But let's look at the running back position, okay? These are running backs under 205 pounds. I was gonna look at 200, but I figured, hey, listen, it's right around that 205-pound mark is when we start to question, like, is this guy going to be durable? Is this guy going to be able to survive the season? Obviously, in terms of fantasy points per game, Christian McCaffrey, he's 202 pounds. He's been electric at almost 24 points per game. Kyron Williams, this is another reason why you and I were so off Kyron. He was 194 pounds coming into the league. He scored over 20 points. Devon Achane, 188 pounds. He scored over 20 points. Raheem Mostert, he's right at 205 pounds, Mike. 18 points. Jahmyr Gibbs, 199 pounds. Austin Eckler, 199 pounds. James Cook, 199 pounds. All these guys had between 13 to 16 points per game. So I think from the RB perspective, if we're going to move forward with drafting these smaller backs, I think it goes to what you said about trusting a coaching system, right? Like you look at Mostert and HN specifically, you look at CMC, you look at Austin Eckler. If you know definitively at the start of the season, or even Jahmyr Gibbs because of his draft capital, that these players are probably going to be given an opportunity and they're going to be given a workload, because that's the biggest thing, right? Is these coaches are sizes as well. So they won't give these smaller running backs typically enough touches to become fantasy relevant. It becomes too risky, right? You need a big play.
Yeah, but I think that what you see, and we talked about this, I think that we kind of there's two different things to talk about here. The first is with a player like Devon Chain, he had that huge blow up stretch and then he went on IR. And he's been a roller coaster since then. So
Yeah.
like if you were banking on him as a wide receiver too or as a locked in flex play, like it's been tough sledding for you,
Mm-hmm.
and the same
Well,
goes
Kyron
along with a
Williams
lot of
got
these.
hurt. Devon Achane got
Yeah.
hurt. Austin Eckler got hurt.
Yeah, I mean, we thought Julian McLaughlin was going to be a thing. He got hurt, or he never really launched in
He
his
did
thing.
nothing.
And we've seen
Yeah.
it kind of historically where these guys have been little flashes in the pan. The Austin Eckler, he's tiny. He's always been tiny, and he
Mm-hmm.
was he was great as a complement piece when he had Melvin Gordon. He had a couple years where he was great, but he's gotten hurt. So I think that the key to it is when you look at what's worked successfully in Detroit, you have a banger like David Montgomery who can absorb the early
Yep.
down work, who can absorb the blows between the tackles, and then you have a consistent role carved out for Jahmyr Gibbs. Like I was hesitant to draft Gibbs at his ADP because I didn't know what his role was going to be. I didn't know if he was
Yeah.
going to be, he was going to get every third series or if he was going to play every series only on third down, if he was going to get some between the tackles work. I just didn't know what his role was going to be. But I think that when you get these smaller guys and they're running in a system with a bigger guy who can absorb the blows and they can come in kind of like what we saw James White be successfully for years and years and years
Yes.
in New England. Like you had LeGarrette Blount who was absorbing the blows, and then James White he performed as an RB1 in primarily a pass catching role. Danny Woodhead was in the same kind of thing where like he was a thing. He didn't have to absorb the blows. He was getting higher quality touches where he was getting passes in space and was getting the opportunity to do things with his legs after he got the ball in his hands. Like those are the players that we can go with. So yeah, I missed out on the Devon Chains of the world because he's just too small for my taste, and he got hurt. He's on IR. He's been up and down, and I think that we can have an argument whether I was right or whether Brandon and Matt were right about that. But if you're relying on him week in and week out, you're not getting it from him week in and week out because he's not in the lineup every week because he's not in the NFL lineup every week. So I think that if you see these guys go into a system where they have a early down guy, then you're in good shape. If you're relying on two smaller scat guys and trying to pick which one every week as an RB2 for yourself, you're going to be in a tough spot. If it's a fill-in flex or a bye-week flex guy, you're in a little bit better spot. But again, that's a playing philosophy. That's a conservative playing philosophy versus an aggressive playing philosophy. I appreciate floor, and I like to build the ceiling in on my flex guys rather than building in ceiling and hoping for ceiling in my positional guys.
Yeah. So when I was looking at this, I looked at just the top 24 running backs in terms of fantasy points per game. And there were 7 players that we talked about just now that were under 205 pounds. That means there's 17 that are above the 205 pounds. And would you look at just like general impact? I mean, Christian McCaffrey, Kyron Williams, Devon Achane, and Raheem Mostert were 4 out of the top 5 in terms of fantasy points per game. And Alvin Kamara was in there right after that. So the thing that we do like about these smaller guys is that it's clear, like when they have an opportunity and they get a few touches and they're healthy, they can be explosive and they can be highly impactful. The problem is you cannot bake if you're drafting them early, you know that on the back end in your bench, you're going to have to go and get a lot of running back depth because yes, you might be comfortable. You spend a lot of draft capital on these early running backs, but you got to make sure that you're protected in the other weeks because they are going to be hurt. You can almost set your watch to it. So I think that's interesting. Before we get to the next one here, we got a question from Recon. It's more so like, how do we feel? So he says, okay, hey guys, have Josh Allen, Swift, Mixon, Amon-Ra, the sun god, Jetta's Waddle, okay, Jalen Waddle, and Njoku in the Colts defense. How do we feel versus Stafford, CEH, James Conner, Pittman, Rice, Kelsey, Atlanta defense? I mean, man, you have a significantly better team. I think a significantly better team. Who do the Colts play this week?
Colts.
I think I've got it here.
Yeah. Hold one second.
Yeah, Colts are playing Pittsburgh. So yeah, I think that's I think you're going to be in pretty good shape. You're going to be in pretty good shape this week. The fantasy playoffs are crazy though, man. Like you never freaking know. I don't know about you, Mike, but I know like we weren't extremely high in Austin Eckler this year for a lot of the reasons. We just worried that it like sometimes if it looks like a what's the expression, Mike? I'm going to butcher this one.
If it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it is a duck.
Thank you. It's probably a duck, right? That's where we were going with Austin Eckler. I made a trade in one of my dynasty leagues, and I'm starting to regret where I traded just straight up it was a rebuilding team, and I'm in a position where I've got a really strong team, and I was making a push for the playoffs. I traded Javonte Williams away to get Austin Eckler in a full PPR league. This was literally after I think he came back and he had like 2 25-point weeks. That's the week that I traded for him, and then he hasn't really scored since. The last week was decent. This week was absolutely abysmal. But
Yeah.
you just never know, man. Like Austin Eckler at this point, like who knows? Can you trust him? Like say I somehow miraculously make it through the playoffs this week with Austin Eckler with the dud that he put up. Am I going to trust him next week to put him in my lineup? Because just last week he put up 25 points.
The problem is,
I just
I
don't know at
think
this
you
point.
have to. Like, do you
Yeah.
have what are your options where you're sitting
Well,
Austin Eckler?
actually, okay. So I actually have good options. So I can only start 3 running backs in this league. Rashad White, I'm starting every single week. I started Austin Eckler, and then I had a decision between Devon Achane and Brees Hall. And as of right now, I've got Achane and Brees Hall out. I'm sitting. I mean, really, what the play was sitting Austin Eckler in hindsight, but you
Yeah.
could not have predicted that game. For those of you out there
No.
who thought that that was what was going to happen, you're bullshitting yourselves, right? There's no way you could have predicted that game. And the fact that he was just completely out of it. I think what killed me the most, and this is just pure, Shane ranting, is that even when it was out of reach, like Austin Eckler wasn't even getting garbage time. It was Josh Kelly that
No.
was in there getting all the touches. And I guess at that point, you're like, listen, we just don't want to get Eckler hurt. He's going to be a free agent next year. So maybe that's more of a, hey, we're trying to help you out here. But like,
He might have
if you're
taken himself out of the game.
that's possible too, right? So yeah, it is what it is. But no, Recon XB, I think you've got a pretty solid shot there to move on. I'm curious to know what the actual what the software projections are. Okay, Mike, I got one more, or I actually got a few more really quickly here. So
Yeah.
kind of in line with the trusting smaller players, how much should we factor age in to our redraft rankings? At this point, it's almost not like I'm looking here at just the running backs who are 25 or older. And again, this is all based off of fantasy points per game, okay? Positional rank. So Christian McCaffrey, 27.5, he was 1. Alvin Kamara's 28, he's RB3. Raheem Mostert is 31, he's RB5. Saquon Barkley is a month away from turning 27. He's 7 overall. David Montgomery, 26, he's 9 overall. Joe Mixon, Austin Eckler, Derrick Henry, they're all 27, 28, 29 respectively. They're the RB 11, 12, and 13. Like at the running back position, it's almost like these guys have been in the league and coaches trust them, therefore they're going to get touches. It's not quite as peppered, but it's interesting to me because historically, at least this is how Shane's brain worked. I always wanted young running backs. I always wanted young running backs. That didn't really play out this year. And that's another reason why the zero RB strategy probably worked, because a lot of people were reluctant to draft these older running backs early, right?
Yeah, and I thought that was part of the reason that I was so high on Bijan this year is that I was like,
Yeah.
McCaffrey has injury history, he's aging. Eckler has injury history, he's aging. I liked Chubb. Chubb wasn't sharing. Chubb's on the younger side though. He's 25, I believe. He had that catastrophic injury. Chubb's either
Yes.
25 or 26.
No,
He wasn't.
Chubb's
It
older
didn't.
actually. I'll double
Is
check. You
it?
keep talking. I'll check. I'll double
It
check.
it didn't look like he was going to share, but I was like, this kid is young coming out of college. He's not going to share. He's a stud. Let's ride. But it just didn't. It's almost like you need the guys year 3, 4, 5. Though that's the sweet spot for the running backs. So I expect to see. Obviously, Bijan will be a first round pick next year. I
Yeah.
expect to see the likes of Javon. I expect to see the likes of Javante jump up in ADP next year. I think Rashad White's going to jump up in ADP next year. I think that whoever the Rams RB1 is,
Mhm.
it looks like it'll be Kyron Williams. I expect to see him jump up next year. So it's not it's not strictly an age thing anymore. It used to be strictly an age thing. I think it's an age tethered to experience thing and experience within the system.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Nick Chubb just turned 28, which is a
Okay.
problem. I mean,
Yeah.
listen, he could still get another 2 to 3 years of good production. So if you were
Yeah.
like me and you went and traded aggressively for him at the start of this season, thinking he's going to be good, there's still hope yet. But um, the fact that Jerome Ford has looked as good as he has, it definitely
Yeah.
makes me a little bit worried about the Nick Chubb workhorse role moving forward, especially with the injury. I got one more, Mike. Do you want to jump to your last point though first?
Yep. Yeah. My last point is actually on the injuries. Don't when it comes to injuries, prepare. Don't hope when you're dealing with them. So like a lot of us were super, super aggressive with, and this will kind of dovetail into the Nick Chubb thing. So,
Mhm.
say Nick Chubb comes back next year, he miraculously somehow is not on pup to start camp. He runs all the way through camp. Understand what that probably is going to mean. It's probably going to mean that Jerome Ford starts the season off as the RB1. Chubb gets eased back in, and then if he stays healthy by week 7 or 8, he's going to be taking over that backfield. It's the same thing we kind of look at with it didn't exactly play out with Brees Hall. Well, Brees Hall was a little bit limited to start the season, and then when he exploded, he really exploded.
Yeah.
But more the Javonte Williams. Like we thought Javonte would be we were expecting him to start the season on pup, miss the first 6 weeks and come back. He miraculously was he participated all at camp. He was active to start week 1. He technically played, but he was really splitting with P. Ryan. McLaughlin mixed in a little bit. And now as we're rounding the season out, once we started into the double-digit weeks, now he's starting to take over that backfield. Um, under, I understand that as optimistic as we like to be, and as far as medical technology has come, it's still an extremely physical sport, and timelines are timelines for a reason. Like
Mhm.
unless something dramatic happens in the way these ACLs are reconstructed or these Achilles are reconstructed or these muscle tears are repaired, like it's you're not going to do much to alter that timeline and do much to alter the outcome. Like obviously you have some freaks like AP, but AP tore his ACL what week 1, week 2, and was back blowing up the next year. Like that was when he set the NFL on fire. That was the year coming back off that, but he tore that early. Like, looking through injured players in camp, players who kind of work through injuries in camp, understand that their range of outcomes is probably going to be slightly diminished. Cooper Kupp is a great example. Like he was injured in camp, he started off inactive, he started off on IR, I believe, came back off IR,
Mhm.
and it hasn't been great. Now part of that is the emergence of a Puka Nakua, but like he's hurt. He's looked hurt. And historically, you look back, like you look at the Julio Jones, you look at the Traylon Burks of the world, guys that have been hurt, have continued to be hurt, and don't expect those injuries to all of a sudden go away and not be what they were. So if you're going to take a flyer on those guys, like if they're dropping, and you're like, there's too much value here, I can't pass on them. Understand what the risk is and understand a way to hedge on it. Perfect example this year um, was where Jonathan Taylor fell when there were all those contract talks, when there was all the injury talk, everything like that. He started dropping into the 3rd and 4th round. So if you
Mhm.
grabbed him in the 3rd and 4th round, you were in okay shape in the middle part of the season when he came back. But if you knew that Zach Moss was going to be the man and you grabbed
Mm.
Zach Moss, you're in great shape because you plugged in Zach Moss when Taylor was out. Taylor came back in. You maybe had 1 or 2 dicey weeks, but then when Taylor went out, you plugged Moss back in, and you had, while the outcome didn't necessarily lend itself to what you hoped it would be, you had a running back in a good offense that was getting a bulk of the work, and that's really
Mhm.
what you want. So, um, understand how injury plays into that. Understand how players work within a system, but kind of hedge against it. If you're getting a discount on a player because of injury, take a complimentary piece a little bit higher than you have to, or than maybe you should, or if it's a fab situation, spend a little bit more than you need to kind of protect yourself against it.
I think so. You mentioned Javante, and I believe it was the ACL last year, right? Is what he injured in
Yep. Yeah,
2022.
he
I think
tore
it
his
was the
ACL.
ACL, right? So you look at early on in the season. To your point, he did play. He didn't have double-digit fantasy points in a full PPR until week 7, but he also didn't have the snap percentage. His highest
Yeah.
snap share was in week 7, where he finally had 53%. Prior to that was week 1 and 2, where he had 45% snap share. Okay, so but then from week 7 on, he had double-digit points every single week except for week 11. And last week, week 14, to get you into the fantasy football playoffs, he actually had his first touchdown scored since 2021. But Javante, if you were just looking at for the first month of the season, almost first 2 months of the season, he was droppable. He was not somebody you wanted to start with confidence. But as the
Yeah.
season's gone on, as he's shown that he's stayed healthy, because that's huge, right? The fact that he's actually stayed healthy, he's a de facto RB2 but you probably don't have to play him as your RB2. You probably have to play him as your flex. So he's
Yep.
in a position where he is producing for you, leading us into the fantasy playoffs. And he actually has this week he's going up against Detroit, which I like. Week 16, I worry he's going up against New England and then the Chargers, which who knows, man? Like I don't even know what to expect from the Chargers at this point. Because there's often that like that kick in the ass teams get after their head coach is fired and the GM is fired. So they say, man, we got to go for it. Or maybe they're just like hands up in the air. Let's just stay healthy. Let's get to the offseason. So that'll be interesting. But I think that's a really acute observation there, Mike, about injuries. And I think you and I are both, again, pretty conservative about injuries. I know Brandon's he's starting to see the way, but he's of course more YOLO when it comes to injuries. I got one last point, and more so it's a question for you. The tight end position looking towards 2024, how it's performed this year has not been great. Like Travis Kelce is trending or currently is still the tight end one in terms of fantasy points per game. So if you drafted him as a tight end one, well, he is there. The problem is he's not differentiating himself, right? He is averaging 16 points per game. You got TJ Hawkinson at 15. Sam Laporta, who was basically, he was free at ADP 112 overall. He was at 14. There's a massive cluster of guys between around 10 to 14 fantasy points per week. And if you just said, screw it, I'm not going to go and I'm not going to spend high draft capital on these players. Mark Andrews was doing very well until he obviously got hurt. George Kittle, he has his boom weeks, but he also has his bust weeks. And then Evan Ingram has been, I'd say Evan Ingram's been pretty steady. But after that, you're rolling the dice with Cole Kmet, David Njoku. Jake Ferguson's coming on hot recently, but to start the season, he wasn't. Dalton Schultz was pretty good most of the season. He's been dealing with some injuries. Darren Waller, obviously, he's been dealing with injuries. Dalton Kincaid has been a lot better with Dawson Knox hurt, but guess what? Dawson Knox is back, right? So going into next year, actually, I don't know if Dawson Knox is is he in his fourth year right now? I believe this is his last rookie deal in a rookie. I'm going to check right now.
No, hold on.
Did they extend him?
They extended him.
Okay, so that's a little bit worrisome for Dalton Kincaid as well. Now maybe rational coaching staff would get Kincaid more involved, but like, are we at the point where it's just kind of like, all right, I'm just gonna wait? Like typically I fade tight end unless it's a tight end premium and it's like these auction leagues, because a lot of the times you can get a discount on them. But if it's just your typical redraft and there's no tight end premium, I don't see any value in really spending up. Like maybe round 4, round 5, you could start to take a shot and look at a player like TJ Hawkinson. But Hawk's going to probably go early, right? Like Hawk's going to go into round 3, I would think.
Yeah,
I'm not willing to spend that capital.
I wouldn't be surprised if you see Hawkinson go in the second round next year. Like he could easily supplant Kelsey as the tight end one off the board. And if you get somebody aggressive and high on him, they could take him, late round, mid to late round 2, just trying to get the advantage at that position. I think what we're seeing though is, and a concern of mine was that these smaller guys and the rookies weren't going to produce. So the fear with Laporta was that he was just below that threshold. It was that 6'4", 240 pounds. He's like 6'3", 235 or something like that. So he's just below that threshold where players produce at tight end. And the other thing is, and we've seen this with Jake Ferguson, and part of it is because, Dalton Schultz is now gone, but it takes, year 2, 3 sometimes to come into it in the NFL. But I think that you got to look at it, kind of situation by situation. And you got to make your call. I did it this year, much to my chagrin. I grabbed Waller in like the 5th round a couple places, and it blew up in my face. So if you want to try it in a spot or two, I'm fine with it. But I think by and large, you really don't need to. Like it's one of those things where you'll be fine if you stream. Like I lost Mark Andrews in a league.
Yeah.
And Chig was my number 2, and I've been fine. Like Andrews was having his good spots, but like Chig has come on a little bit, and it's like if you go from Christian McCaffrey if you go from the RB1 to the RB
40,
15, catastrophic, absolutely catastrophic.
Yeah.
Tight end 2 to tight end 12, tight end 14, not as catastrophic. You can make it up. So I think that people are going to revert back to what they always did at tight end, where If you're a tight end early guy, if you're differentiate yourself at the onesie positions guy or girl, you'll stay there. If not, you'll revert back. I'm going to revert back for the most part.
Where do you think Travis Kelce is going to go next year? Is he going to be a round 1 pick, or is he going to fall to round 2 after this season?
Now he'll fall to round 2. He'll be tight end. He'll probably be tight end 4.
I think Kelce is going to be at least tight end. I think Kelce is going to be tight end 1 still.
You think?
I do. Yeah. If people are going to be drafting TJ Hawkinson in round 2, Travis Kelce is going to be drafted in round 2.
I think it all depends. It depends on the Minnesota quarterback situation. If you get a rookie quarterback coming in, you get a rookie quarterback coming in who isn't as comfortable in the NFL, then I think you got to downgrade Hawkinson just a little bit. But if Kirk Cousins ends up back there, the pace that guy was on, he was firing bullets all over the place. He was on pace for close to 5,000 yards this year. So to be able to feed JJ, to be able to feed Hawkinson, to be able to feed Addison, you need an experienced NFL quarterback to do that.
Jen, you're trying to troll. You're trying to troll us, Jen. Hey, I don't know if there's any truth to this, because I was just scrolling my Instagram and I saw this and it's a rumor, but apparently because of Al Michaels' comments, something along the lines of you can't let the sideshow become the show, that NBC isn't going to let him do any playoff games. I still believe Al Michaels is the best in the business. He's one of my favorites. I hate that he's stuck on the Thursday night games in perpetuity, but I guess gotta follow that money.
They'll still let freaking Chris Collinsworth call playoff games, though. Ugh.
I like Chris. I don't know. There's for some reason I like Chris Collinsworth. I understand why he's cringeworthy for sure, but there's just something that's familiar with him for me, and so maybe it's more of a familiarity type thing. What's going to be interesting next year? Tom Brady is actually going to go into the booth, right, with Fox. That's still a plan.
Yeah,
as far as I know.
Yep.
So that'll mean I don't know how he'll be. I'm still. I don't know. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting.
I don't think he'll be great. I don't think he's going to be Tony Romo great.
No, I don't either. I don't know. But hey, listen, I didn't think Tony Romo would be great, and he has been fantastic. And Greg Olsen also has been fantastic. So
yep.
Sometimes you just don't know. Oh God, here we go. So this is Jen. It's hilarious. As soon as my daughter sees Casey on the TV, she says, "Oh, Mom, Taylor Swift has to be there, right?" Yeah. Well, I mean, okay. So listen. So all the boomers out there, all the I don't like Taylor Swift. The NFL is about the cash, man, and it's always a good thing if more eyes are going to be on the NFL, and I don't think it's a bad thing. So listen, is it slightly annoying that the game sometimes always goes to Taylor Swift and it's always cameras on Taylor Swift? Yeah, it's a little annoying, but does it really matter to me at the end of the day? Not really. Do what you got to do. If it's going to bring more eyes to the NFL, it's good for the NFL. It's good for the sport. Just let it happen, people. Just let it happen.
Yeah. Jen, and I tell your daughter, say when the Eagles come on, say go Taylor's boyfriend's brother.
There you go. Go Taylor's boyfriend's brother. And that's it, Mike. We're wrapping up the show. So it's going to be a transition period. So we're going to have a show next week. I'm not going to be on the following week because I'm going to be down in beautiful Los Angeles, bringing the family down to Disney and Universal. So looking forward to that. But we'll try to make sure we get some content for you guys out there. Yeah, and you know what? Listen, just good luck into the fantasy football playoffs. This is the hardest thing to do, is to get to the fantasy football playoffs. You're here, you've made it, and I think that you need to make sure you maintain more of a DFS mindset when you're setting your lineups here. Okay, I understand there's process. I still say play your studs, but when you're looking at those flex type plays, you really have to understand it's a week to week at this point, and you need to win the week this week. So if there's question marks around a player, I think just fade that player. Fade that player. If that player is going to be injured, the worst thing in the world is starting a player, letting them get a 0 because they leave early in the week. A player like Nico Collins, I think he was ruled, he said he's going to be out. He's officially questionable. Nico, you're not going to my lineup. Even if you're active by some miracle, you're not going in my lineup. So that's it. Good luck. Let us know how you did in your fantasy football playoffs. Hit us up on Twitter /X at DFS Army. And go crush some souls. For Mike, I'm Flex Shane, and we are the DFS Army Fantasy Football Show. Good luck. Big time. No man, diamonds in my teeth. I got a lot of